Yes, so this meeting is being recorded for future reference. Thank you so much for our guest. We have Dr. Miguel Rodriguez, a recent graduate from the Florida International University in Miami. Dr. Miguel is now a postdoc at the University of Utah, where he works with Dr. Ramon Bartolome. Today, he's bringing us discussions over multiple imputation and some theoretical frameworks to focus on some of the theoretical frames that guide Dr. Rodriguez's work. And so here we are, looking forward to sit down and learn from you. So thank you, Dr. Miguel. Really appreciate you, and the audience. Let's make some noise for our guests. Thank you so much. Hey.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I know that's so cliche, but for real, I appreciate y'all inviting me to talk to y'all. Yeah, so first of all, I apologize for any background noise that sometimes there's like a car that passes by that decides to, I don't know, have music playing or something. So I apologize for that in advance. But anyways, my talk today is going to be about, the first thing I'll discuss is multiple imputation, which is a quantitative like data cleaning technique. And then I'll talk about some of the theoretical frameworks I've used in my work. And yeah, right now I'm at the University of Utah. I'm doing my postdoc under Ramon Bartolome. And so far I've been enjoying it, been there for 2 months, since September. But anyways, yeah, so a brief background. So my doctoral research involved measuring and observing cognitive and affective outcomes of students in introductory physics, particularly in a modeling instruction classroom. If you don't know what that is, I'm not going to mention it again, but it's a type of pedagogy that involves small group learning. So students just work in small groups the entire class. And yeah, I just finished my PhD, as Brian said, in August. So I understand perfectly well how all of y'all are doing in your struggle to finish your degrees, which I'm sure all of you will eventually do. And yeah, now I'm doing diversity, equity, and inclusion research at the University of Utah as a postdoc. So it's quite a change, but I'm enjoying it. Yeah, so like I already said, first I'll go over multiple imputation, and then I'll go over physics identity, social interdependence, and critical race theory. So multiple imputation is a way to preserve statistical power. It's a quantitative method. You could use with survey data or any type of realistic data that you attain. And basically it's a way of preserving statistical power and handle missing data. And it's much more robust than common practices such as list-wise deletion, which is just like deleting individual missing responses. So let's say, for example, you want to do a regression of, I don't know, 6 variables or something, right? A multiple linear regression. The way most algorithms will handle that is if one of those 6 variables, if the student didn't put one of those 6 didn't fill in the survey one of those 6 variables, then it'll just cut that whole student out of the analysis. So basically, multiple imputation is a way of filling in, while accounting for random error, those like you know, those items that students may miss while doing a survey. And yeah, it takes a distribution of the observed data collected and iteratively estimates the missing values while accounting for random error. So first I want to just talk about, the next slide is going to just be on a single imputation, which is not multiple imputation, but I just want people to kind of understand what I mean by imputation. So here's an example of a single imputation. So again, this is not taking into account random error. This is just one imputation. And this imputation, if you look at the photo, basically the red dots are the missing data points. And what it does is if you have missing Y values, well, it would just basically pick the corresponding Y value from the regression given that X value, right? So it'll fill in the Y value given that you know the X value, right? Which is like, makes sense, right? Like it's a logical way of trying to like fill in the data, right? But this is, again, this is not multiple imputation. It's just an example so you guys can kind of imagine what one imputation does. Now, there's different ways of doing a single imputation. You could do it like, there's like mean imputation, this is regression, but I'm not gonna get into specifics. That would all have to do with like your model and like what you're looking for and whatever. But anyways, yeah, now, so obviously, so multiple imputation, the reason why you want to do that over just a single imputation, right, is because multiple imputation takes into account random error, or like this random component of students actually filling in data, right? And the fact that students are like real people, so it's not, survey data is just not as clean as like experimental data, for example. So these random components can vary on the type of model that is needed. I think the way that Emilia, which is a program I'll talk about, handles random error is basically, it's like a Gaussian, the random, like the random part of the imputation is basically like Gaussian distributed. I don't know if that makes, I didn't put any equations in the slides, but I can go into more detail if people want later. And yeah, this accounts for random error when using techniques to complete a data set. And it makes missing data more, filling in missing data more realistic when you take into account this type of error. Continue. So there are generally 3 phases with using this technique, okay? The first phase is the imputation phase, or the fill-in phase, where the missing data are filled in with estimated values and complete data set is created, and a complete data set is created. And this is the process of filling in, and it's repeated m times because it's a multiple imputation, right? So each imputation is going to be a little bit different than the other imputations because they're taking into account this random coefficient, or, well, I'm not going to get into specifics, but random error. So yeah, so then you have multiple data sets, and then you take those multiple data sets, 5 or 10. 5, I think, is like the pretty standard amount. And you basically analyze each of the 5 data sets as if they were independent data sets. Now, they're all software, and I'm going to talk about how software can make all this super easy for you. But that's basically like how you would handle it, like by hand. You would have to analyze each of the data sets individually. And then once you analyze each of the data sets individually, go through the pooling phase, which is how do you combine those data sets, right? And it depends, like there's a way of combining data sets, like for example, you can combine multiple, well, not multiple, you have to be careful with the terminology. Yep, you can combine like imputed data sets using, like, for example, Robin's rule, which is like taking the average in some specific way. It's not just the average, it's like the average over, like, I don't remember exactly, but anyways, to actually use this in practice, at the end of the day, as most of you guys know, it's just a matter of knowing how to use some software. So the package that, the best package for multiple imputation is Amelia. It's on the 2nd version, so technically Amelia 2, but if you just look up Amelia and like RStudio, like you'll find it. And then there's another package called zlig, which basically is a package that can read the output files that the Amelia software like generates. So you can use zlig, the package zlig, to do your analysis on Amelia. Now, zlig is limited. It doesn't have all the statistical types of techniques that you may want. So that's why here I put there's another way of combining things manually, which is using this thing called Robin's rule. You could do the individual analysis of the multiple imputations and then combine them manually, which I have had to do that on, I think, like the R² values of my work. So yeah, the last thing I want to say about this is that there's a lot of depth to this multiple imputation. Like there's obviously like a bunch of statistical knowledge, and I don't have that much statistical knowledge like that. To be quite, I'm not an expert on multiple imputation, but I have used it for 4 years. And even though, so I know like how to use it, and I've had to use it like in different data sets. So there are some things to learn, but anyways, it's like everything, there's a manual, and the manual is very helpful actually for Amelia. And zlig has like a whole website dedicated to helping you. So some conclusions, so we can create complete data sets from incomplete ones using various techniques, one of them being this multiple imputation technique that I just presented. And even if you don't use multiple imputation, it is recommendable that you use some type of method for preserving the statistical power of your data set when it comes to quantitative research, obviously. So that's that. And like I already said, multiple imputation has much more depth than just the knowledge I presently possess. And like all R packages, there are manuals for Zlig and Amelia that can be really helpful. So that's the end of like quantitative stuff. The rest of the stuff is more theoretical frameworks. And actually, I forgot to say this. I'm not going to talk about linear or factor regressions, just because I know people probably are pretty familiar with linear regressions, and it's not that much of an extension. And I felt like if I had to cut something out of the 5 things that I was going to present, that was the thing to cut. So I want to have time for questions later because people will probably be interested in the next few things that I say. So the next thing I want to talk about is identity, right? So I'll just start with like identity in general, right? So the concept of identity is a very deep topic that spans multiple disciplines. And here, of course, I'm going to focus on identity in educational terms, right? So the most general like identity is STEM identity, for us at least. That's interest to us education researchers. I think most of us are physics people, so really physics identity is probably what's most interesting to us. But you know, it's good to keep these like different things in mind. Like for example, right now my postdoc is analyzing students in STEM, not just physics. So like, you know, even though like while you're doing physics, you may want to use physics identity, like it's good to know that these other identities exist, like math identity, computer science identity, engineering identity. So yeah, it's good to know these things. Now physics identity is the type of identity most pertinent to us because we're a physics education research community, and yeah, and how students see themselves as physicists. And physics identity is an important framework because there is strong evidence for its prediction of student career choices. So students that have high physics identity have been shown to choose physics as a major. And I'll talk why that's important in a little while. Yeah, so physics identity, the best way I could summarize physics identity is just using this diagram, which I hope is clear. I guess it's clear enough. I made the picture like bigger than what I used before, and I didn't like remake the picture, but anyways. Yeah, so physics identity consists of interest in physics, which I think is, you know, makes sense, right? You have to be interested in physics to consider yourself a physics person. It also consists of performance and competence beliefs, which are the beliefs in one's ability to perform and be competent in physics. Often, this performance competence beliefs is very similar to self-efficacy. So like if you've heard about self-efficacy, it's a bit similar to this performance competence belief. There's a bit of a distinction, but unless you're really going to work with like self-efficacy and physics identity, you really don't need to know the distinction. They're pretty much similar. And yeah, and most critically, actually, the most important out of these 3 sub-constructs is recognition beliefs. So the beliefs that one perceives recognition from others as a physics person. So, so that's actually the most important out of the 3. And it's important to keep in mind that this is a self like measured, right? Like we ask the students how they feel about these things. So how they feel they were being recognized, or how they felt about how they could perform. Yeah.
You're saying that it's important. It's like the most important. What do you mean? What makes it important?
Yeah. What by important I mean it's the strongest predictor of physics identity. Thank you. That's important because well, yeah, important is just so broad, right? Doesn't mean anything. But yes, thank you. And yeah, feel free if anybody has a question at any point. Feel free to ask. I should have said that in the beginning, but I didn't. I apologize. Yeah, so physics identity is useful. There's a valid and reliable quantitative instrument that measures a person's physics identity. So that's something I think if you, I'm gonna go back, but in this paper right here is where you could actually find that survey. And then some other key findings from this construct that may interest people is that so they've actually found that women in general tend to have lower physics identity than men, which reflects a wider cultural problem, right? And the reason we know it's an American culture problem, not anything else, is because there are other countries where the number of men and women in physics are the same, right? Like India, for example, like, so they're like 50-50. In Iran, there's more women physicists than men physicists. So we know that it's not like anything, which we already know, but like it's obvious that it's not like a gender thing, right? It's not like men can do physics and women can't. No, that doesn't make sense. What it is, it's a cultural problem, right? And actually, I could expand on that a little bit. I guess, what time is it? No, I'm not going to expand on that a little bit. If anybody's wondering about that, I can. Oh, what is this? Is this chat? Hold on. Well, it actually could be given to anybody. That's a good question. It could be given to undergraduate or graduate students or even faculty. My advisor told me that there's actually a case where there was a faculty physicist that did not consider themselves a physics person. And they were renowned in their field. Like they were like one of the top, like it was like it was like experimental physics or something like that. I don't remember exactly the branch, but yeah, so it could be used even for faculty. It's just like a general survey. What was I gonna say? Well, that's it. Yeah, so the last point, which is important. So studying physics identity, right, could be a key to increasing the representation of women in the field, right? Trying to figure out ways of improving the identity, the physics identity of women. And in our case, through education, right? Like that's the point of our research, right? So yeah, so that's all I want to say on physics identity. But again, my idea for the talk is to introduce things, and then if people want to know more things, I can kind of just expand on like the things that I know. Okay, hold on. So the next topic that I want to talk about is social interdependence. Now, social interdependence is a theory of how cooperation exists. So cooperation cannot happen without the components of interdependence, right? So this is a key theory for understanding how any group of people cooperate in any context. It could be sports, it could be, well, in my case, it was students in a modeling instruction classroom, right, where they were learning physics, but it could be in anything. So the best way of summarizing social independence that I have is through this diagram. So this figure provides a visual representation of social interdependence theory. Here we can see that the outer ring of positive interdependence leads to promotive interactions. So like you could see there's double-headed arrows, and I'll explain that in a moment, which then leads to the outcomes of effort to achieve, positive relationships, and social competence, right? This social competence sometimes is referred to as psychological health, right? So to just say in other words, like and I'll just say it in the context of students working in a class, since we're all like physics education researchers. When students are working together successfully in a group, right, and they exhibit positive interdependence, that leads to all the students, or most of the, whatever students are interacting really, that leads to those students having more effort to achieve, forming positive relationships, and improving their social competence. And actually my research did actually observe this in the physics classroom. I won't talk about the results, but it is what it is. The next thing I want you to notice is the double arrows in the diagram, right? So it means that this relationship is not just that students that have positive interdependence have those three subconstructs. There's also the reverse. It's also that for a group of students to have positive interdependence, the students, the individual students need to have effort to achieve, they have to form positive relationships, and they have to have some social competence, right? Or some psychological health, right? Be happy, be okay mentally and socially. So when students have those things, it also leads to social interdependence. So there's this reciprocal relationship between like social interdependence, or positive interdependence, I should say, and these outcomes, because these outcomes are also subconstructs of social interdependence. I hope that was like okay the way I said all that. And yeah, like I said, these subconstructs are also necessary conditions for cooperation to develop in any group, no matter the context. So that's, yeah, that's the best way I can explain it. So social interdependence exists when the actions of individuals are affected by each other's actions. That is the simplest like definition of when it exists, by the Johnson and Johnson people, which are the folks that basically modernized social interdependence theory. And the types of social interdependence among students that can exist among students working in groups, for example, could be positive interdependence, which occurs when students' mutual dependence on each other helps each individual to achieve their learning goals, right? So they're helping each other. You can have negative interdependence, which is when students work against each other to accomplish their goals. So this is like cooperation. This is like, I want to get the answer before you can type of thing, you know? Then you can have dependence, which occurs when the achievement of one individual is affected by another individual, but not vice versa, right? So when the interaction only favors one student, right? Or for example, another example of dependence, of social dependence, is instructor to student interaction, right? Because an instructor, well, I'm not saying instructors don't learn more physics as they're teaching, because the more you teach something, the more little things you learn, right? But in general, instructors don't really gain anything from explaining things to student, right? Like they don't benefit in any way besides like getting paid, and that's their job. But they don't like benefit like in like the physics knowledge sense, right? So that's like a dependent interaction, right? The student is dependent on the instructor for the knowledge. And then you can also have independence, right? When just people don't want to work together, they just rather work individually. And I could talk about like individualism beliefs and cooperation beliefs. Like there's a lot of stuff to talk about there. Hold on, let me check the chat real quick. An example of social dependence be like one person cares about another's test scores, but not vice versa. Well, I don't know about caring, because caring is, I'll think about that question. Hannah, be patient. And maybe at the end you could tell me like what you're thinking about, like when you asked me or do you want to tell me now? You're welcome to tell me like.
I guess I could like clarify right now. By cares, I guess I mean like has a one-sided competition in this, and could like impact interactions in a group one way but not another way. But you can think about it longer.
Well, I'll tell you this: competition has been proven to have a negative impact on students. Like, it's actually better for them. The best is for them to cooperate, like in small groups, like from like the stuff that I've read in my research. But then even when they work individually, it's better than them competing, because then they form like negative feelings towards each other, right? Like I have to beat this person. Like when people have to cooperate, it leads to like more positive feelings, more, right? Like more positive vibes, because like people are trying to do things together. And then when people know that like their grade is going to be, and this is actually, I really hate these types of classes where professors decide like, oh, well, like the best project gets this grade, then the next best project gets this grade, and then the next best project. I mean, it's horrible because it just creates competition amongst the students, which like for economics and business is a good thing, right? But not for learning, right? And it's just like students can develop these negative feelings towards each other, right? I don't know, but anyways, I don't know if that, maybe I didn't answer your question at all, but yeah. Thank you for your question. Yeah, so some of the benefits of social interdependence include academic success, quality of relationships. Go ahead.
Sorry, there may have been another question. Ira, did you have something?
Do your thing.
Yeah, I was just thinking, is like an example of this kind of positive social interdependence maybe in like upper division labs where students are working in groups on one apparatus? Or I'm just trying to get a grip on what exactly you mean by social independence and positive and negative.
Yes, yes, absolutely. That could be an example of positive social interdependence, students working in a lab together, because one student is doing something while another student is doing another thing, and they need each other's actions to fulfill the project, to like do the actual experiment. Yeah, and there's actually different types of interdependence, right? Like there's like task interdependence, which is like how much the students depend on each other to achieve a task. There's outcome interdependence, which is like similar but not the same, which is like how much students depend on each other for the outcome, not just like on actually doing the task. Um, there's a few interdependences. I don't remember like other ones, but there's like role interdependence, I think, where like, you know, students may have different roles and depend on each other for those different roles, right? Like, so it's yeah, but that was a good question. Yes, and that's absolutely an example of positive interdependence. Students working in a lab. And actually, from my research, I found when students are doing experiments, they're very interdependent because they're just like, they're like physically dependent on each other, right? Like one is doing the computer, one is doing that, like, and then they communicate, like they're trying to figure out what's going on. So there's a lot of elements of that that could be useful. So yeah, so let me move on to the next topic because I realize it's 6:30 and this is gonna take me like at least 10 minutes to talk about. But it's cool because y'all are asking me at the same time, so it's all good. So this next topic is actually the the research theoretical framework that I'm using now as a postdoc, and it's critical race theory. So the past few months I've been reading a few things about critical race theory, some papers. I read a book on it. I want to read another book. But anyways, I'm still learning about critical race theory, so there's a lot to learn. But I'll at least share with y'all the stuff that I've learned. And actually, these slides, I'll be straight up honest with you guys. These slides came from when I presented a paper on critical race theory of education. So I just use the slides, but I expanded a little bit. So, and the paper that I use for like most of these slides is right there. So I had shared the link. Actually, I should have made sure people got the link on the chat, right? Is that?
I think it doesn't show up if you come in after the link, but I'll copy and paste it for everyone.
All right, cool. Thank you, thank you. Yeah. So if you want like the slides for whatever, feel free. You can download it. I think you should be able to download it. I think. All right. So let me just continue on here. Yeah. So the article that was just in the previous page postulates 3 basic propositions to critical race theory. And I'll go into these issues in detail. So I'm just going to present them. The first is that race continues to be significant in the United States. The second is that U.S. society is based on property rights rather than human rights, which is very deep, yo, like very deep. But anyways, you'll see what I mean in a moment. And the third is that the intersection of race and property creates an analytical tool for understanding inequity. And actually, before I forget to say, critical race theory actually originates from legal studies. So it's actually a very useful framework for lawyers that defend people of color. So I think that's actually part of the reason why there's been an attack on it, because it's actually been effective, you know? But anyways, all right, let's get into it. So race continues to play a major role every day in American society, and particularly in education. So in society, people, probably all of us can agree that yes, race continues to play all of us agree with that statement. And in education, I'll give a few examples in a little while. There's no scientific basis for race. So the idea of race actually makes no sense biologically speaking. It's like saying, I don't know, a hummingbird is like a yellow, like we don't do races for birds or animals, it's just people, right? And the point of saying that is that racially is something socially constructed, the idea of race. It's not a scientific concept. Another thing about race that's important to know is that it's necessary for a complete picture of inequity along with gender and class, right? So you can't just like, so just considering gender and class is not enough to consider how someone could be oppressed, right? And actually not even just race, gender, and class, right? There's other things that sexual orientation, being an immigrant, right? Like there's other things that, other reasons why people may be oppressed, right? And that concept is basically this concept of intersectionality. It's just that these different things, so you can be oppressed in these different ways, right? And then there's this other concept of double consciousness, which I'll just mention, which Webb Du Bois published, I think, in the 30s, and the double consciousness refers to the internal conflict experienced by subordinated groups in an oppressive society. So this could be African Americans in the United States. It could be indigenous people. Well, yeah, I mean, it could be any group of people that have been subordinated in some way or marginalized. All right, so property, right? So property rights are more important than human rights in the US. Can anybody give some examples?
Redlining, banks
right.
deciding that that Black people can't live in certain neighborhoods, and then adjusting housing prices.
Anybody else?
Local taxes stay in the, for schools, stay in the like district that the houses are in. So if there's more expensive houses in an area, there's higher property taxes. So the schools are better funded.
Yep. Here, Aliyah said, homeless person getting arrested for sleeping in park. Yep, exactly right. The park is more important than the person. Exactly. Which is terrible, right? And I'll give you some more examples, right? Taking land from Native Americans, right? Slaves in America were considered property, for existence, right? Military conquest of Mexico, right? It's actually interesting. I don't know if people follow. I'm actually quick side note is I'm living in Mexico, so my in-laws always remind me of this, that the Americans stole Mexican land. But anyways, but yeah, it happened. And there's actually a pretty good video that I saw a few months ago on that, like how that all happened, how the president at the time like sent in like 80 people and to purposely get slaughtered, to then say, hey, Mexicans are killing our people, and then the whole, anyways, but sorry. Yeah, a central feature of power is the ability to define, possess, and own property. And exactly, somebody already touched upon this, property in relation to school system. That's exactly right. So if you have an area with higher property values, they're gonna pay higher property taxes, which is gonna lead to better public school system in those neighborhoods, because that's the money that's funding those neighborhoods, right? Those local taxes. And intellectual property, which actually this is something I never thought about before doing this research, which is knowledge costs money schools, like, so that limits like how much a school can offer students, right? So like a school in a poorer neighborhood will literally, they can't spend as much money on textbooks, on materials to teach those classes, right? So the students in those schools, because of that, have less options in what they can study and what they can do, which is terrible, right? But it's the reality. Yeah, so another thing is, and some of these things, some of y'all don't know, this segregation benefited white people more than people of color. So actually a lot of African-American teachers and administrators lost their jobs after the segregation, because those black schools, well, a lot of them got cut. A lot of them didn't make the cut, So that's interesting, right? Just something I never knew until doing this research. Like I believe the majoritarian story, which is well, segregation is good for everybody, right? But there were people of color that actually were hurt by desegregation. And I'm not saying that we should keep segregation, because I think it was a good thing, right? But like, it's just something you don't think about, right? Another thing that most of us probably know is African American and Hispanic students have a high suspension, expulsion, and dropout rates, right? In all levels, university, all levels. Neutrality, objectivity, colorblindness, and meritocracy should all be challenged, right? So neutrality is this idea of just always want to be neutral, right? Like, oh, it doesn't affect me. I don't really care, right? Objectivity is the concept of truth independent of individual subjectivity, right? So the idea that everybody experiences the same truth, which is not true, right? Colorblindness, which is saying, oh, well, America's not racist anymore, right? Like, we had a black president, right? Everything's been solved. And actually, I mean, people say that, right? These are like real things people say. And meritocracy, this idea that everything that you have is earned when, like, I don't have the study, but my advisor shared with me a couple years ago that the highest predictor of having wealth in America is if your parents were rich, like if they had wealth. Like, it's not like this, like everybody lives this American dream. Like, some people do, right? And that's great that at least it exists to some extent, but it's not the general like consensus. And also giving a voice to people of color is important. And the first step towards justice, which is actually why I'm interviewing people of color for my research, you know, trying to give them a voice, right? And there's a bunch of things like, but it's a short talk. Another thing is white privilege has been linked to the legal subordination of blacks and the seizure of native lands. And white privilege, there's a paper by I think it's Peggy McIntosh is her name. She wrote a paper in the 80s, I think it was, and she had like 28, like a list of 28 things that were like white privilege, like a list of the different privileges, which is very interesting. One of them that comes to mind quickly is the privilege of when you call the manager, like when you call for the manager in a restaurant, the chances are that person will look like you, right? The chances are that person will be a white person, you know, so it's, anyways. And whiteness is actually valuable, it's valuable and is property, right? There are 4 property functions of whiteness: rights to the position, which is students are rewarded only for conformity to perceived white norms and sanctioned for cultural practices. So this could be how they dress, how they talk, unauthorized conceptions of knowledge, like alternative ways of thinking, right? Rights to use and enjoy. So whiteness allows for extensive use of school property. So this is like, the idea is like the curriculum at white schools versus black schools is just much more vast in general. Obviously, I'm sure there are exceptions. There's always exceptions to stuff. Reputation and status property. So reputation as property, and this idea that the absolute right to exclude, which is like if you have one drop of black blood, you're no longer white, right? This was the law, I think, in South Carolina, one of the Carolinas. Like, I always get them confused. Sorry if you're from South or North Carolina. It's not that I don't like the Carolinas, I just always get them confused. In one of those states, actually, it was the law. If a person had one drop of black blood, they were considered a slave. That's just from law. And actually, for a long time, the Supreme Court actually decided who was white and who was not white. And depending on that would depend on if you could come into the country for a while, until the 50s or 60s. And then that's actually why since the 50s or the 60s, we've seen I forgot what immigration policy was passed, but we've seen like an vast increase in like diversity, like people from African countries, South American countries, blah, 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 blah. But anyways, that's like, again, there's so much history to all this, right? So, and yeah, there's so much more to say. I'm almost done, I promise. You know, you got microaggressions, right? So overt racism has been socially condemned, right? In general, right? Like people, like obviously not everywhere and not always, but overt calling someone the N-word or something, right? but racism continues to live on through the forms of microaggressions, right? A simple example, right? The other day, in one of the studies that I'm doing now, right? A student told me that he had this black professor for the first time in all his classes. You know, he had a black professor teaching him. He was a computer science person, and he was like, "Wow, I have a black professor teaching me this class, right? So cool." And then later in the semester, the black professor accuses him of cheating. You know, and he's a black student, and without any proof. You know, and it's just like, you know, and there's like some papers, like the accusing of cheating is very common, which is a microaggression, right? It's almost like, oh, you don't have the ability to do this work, like, so you cheated, right? Which is horrible, because the guy actually had a background in digital media and journalism, and he told me he was always a good writer, like always. But anyways, yeah. So another idea is affirmative action. Sometimes there's a lot of microaggressions towards people of color, well, especially like underrepresented groups, not just like, not Asian, not including Asian people like everybody else, because Asian people are an overrepresented group in STEM. But underrepresented groups, you know, they report like other like white students or American students saying, oh, well, you're only here because of affirmative action, right? Like, anyways, there's a bunch of examples. Intersectionality, which I already talked about, but I do want to say it was a concept born from Black women scholars. And it does take into account that oppression is not only due to one characteristic like race, right? Oppression exists for gender, class, sexual orientation, etc. There's also this idea of interest convergence, which again is really interesting. This idea that the civil rights movement happened to line up with the interests of the elites. And that's actually why like a lot of moves were made. But I won't spend a lot of time talking about that. Then there's this idea of majoritarian stories, which is very deep actually, which are the stories that exist and get propagated without us even realizing it, right? When you watch a movie, when you watch a show, when you watch whatever, right? Like there are stories that are being told, right? That kind of like enter our mind, right? Like for example, maybe the Black person tends to be a servant, or you know, or the Hispanic person is a drug dealer, gang member. I don't know. It's like, you know, you see enough of these things and you kind of start believing. And actually, and it's not just white people. It's everybody. We're all we all believe and buy into these majoritarian stories. I'll give you an example that includes Brian and PR and all that, like PERC. My first PERC, or no, when we were in Salt Lake City, not Salt Lake City, Provo. I remember I told Brian, I was like, we're in the real America, right? Because you know, I lived in Miami, a bunch of Hispanic people, right? So it's like a bunch of colored people everywhere. And even like white people in Miami speak Spanish. Like it's just so, it is Hispanic first. So anyways, I was saying, wow, now we're in the real America, right? Like there's a lot of white people, right? And Brian corrected me. He's like, nope, like you're propagating like this idea that America is white, right? And it's just like, damn, you know, like, you know, it's just like, so a lot of this has to, so I guess like a way of trying to combat these ideas that we just have, that we don't even know we have until somebody questions it, and it's like, oh, or we don't know why we have these ideas. I think a lot of that stuff could be like managed through just talking to people and just like just talking about those things, right? That sometimes we don't want to talk about, but we should. And yeah, I mean, I just went to a seminar yesterday on anti-Blackness technology, which was incredible. It talked about how artificial intelligence like is biased, right? Because if you feed it like information, it's going to be biased towards whatever you feed it. And there's a bunch of stories like Google, when they made their Google Photos, like when they first implemented their artificial intelligence algorithm, it had Black people as, it was identifying Black people as monkeys, right? The artificial intelligence, right? So it's like, obviously it's not purposeful, right? But it's just that artificial intelligence will be good at whatever you feed it. So if you feed it a lot of information on white people, then when you feed it information on Black people, it's not gonna know what to do, right? Because it's just like, well, I haven't seen that many of this, so it doesn't build the the algorithms, because that's what artificial intelligence does. It just builds like linear regressions, like super fancy linear regressions, guys. It's not like so incredible, but anyways, but that's pretty much it. That's the talk. So yeah, I think I went over what I wanted, but at least some people asked me stuff during. So yeah, thank you guys. Thank you for inviting me. I hope some of you guys found this stuff helpful. And if people need more resources or anything, I can share my email. Let me share my email now, actually. Let me stop sharing. All right. Do y'all have any questions?
One.
There you go, if anybody wants to email me. Yeah, go ahead.
First of all, thank you very much for this presentation. It was very interesting and I like the flow of it. So my question has to do with whether you have seen any studies, or what is your opinion about using more than one theoretical frameworks to shape one study. For example, to me, it makes sense, for example, if you're studying self-efficacy, that a social cognitive theory would fit. I mean, is a good lens to look at your data. But at the same time, when you're trying to interpret results comparing, different racial ethnic groups, the critical race theory also makes sense. Is a good lens also to look at it. So how do you think we should navigate? What is your suggestion about navigating when choosing the most appropriate theoretical framework?
So this is qualitative research, right?
Well, it's a mixed methods study.
Okay. I mean, I would say that you can use whatever theoretical frameworks you think you need to be using. It's just a matter of justifying why you're using it. That's always the hard part. But as long as you justify why you're using it, I think that's the important thing. Because I have read, so there's actually people that I forgot the name, but there's theorists that don't believe in using theoretical frameworks. Like for I can't remember. She gave one of the panel talks in this summer. Per Hispanic woman, what was her name? Bodega? No, I don't remember her name.
Mildred Boveda?
Yeah, like her, right? She, like, I don't know if people caught her talk, and I'm sorry that I'm referring like something that happened months ago. But basically, like, she refused to use to limit herself in a theoretical framework. Like, she said that from the beginning. She's like, this work does not utilize one single framework. Like it uses varies, and she didn't limit. So there's people actually don't limit themselves like to particular frameworks, but you just have to explain why. So that's what I would say. I would say you could use whatever theoretical framework you think you should be using to get the answers to your research questions. The hard part is justifying why. That's where the work. But if you can justify why, I don't think people will complain, because if they say, "Oh, why did you use this?" Well, you already said why, right? So yeah, and yeah, I've had colleagues that use multiple frameworks that don't mix so well, but they are perfect for what they need to do. Like maybe like for general purposes they wouldn't mix, but because they're doing something specific that like utilizes aspects of several frameworks, and yeah, you got it. Is it grounded? Go ahead. No, go ahead. I'm sorry. No, go ahead.
Thanks for your talk. My question, I think, kind of builds off of what Diana was asking, and what connections between these three frameworks do you see since you've been working with them for a while now?
That's a good question. That's a very high level question too, right? Because that's like the synthesis, the maximum of Bloom's taxonomy. So I could definitely see connections between physics identity and social interdependence. In my study that I did, which was studying students in small groups in the modeling instruction classroom, which is like a methodology where students just work in small groups. And I did see that that students did have high recognition beliefs when they did like cooperate with the group, right? Like when they like initiate tasks, right? Like when they, which makes sense, right? If a student talks more, they're going to feel more recognized because it gives their peers more chance to recognize them, right? Like the more you talk, the more chances your peers have to like know, like to be able to say, oh wow, or to know that you know stuff, right? Like if you don't talk, then if you talk less often, then people won't recognize you as much. So I found that connection in my research, but the critical race theory, connecting that to the other stuff is hard. It's a bit harder. I haven't done that yet, and I'm in the middle of doing that. But it's not going to be so clear cut because, well, the fixed identity is not going to connect much because I'm not studying physicists. I'm studying STEM people for that research. So maybe STEM identity would be more connected to that. Yeah, no, that's a very good question. I don't have a great response for that. That's a good question. And I'll keep thinking about that question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just like to make some space for anybody else before I ask my question.
Well, Hannah, is it grounded theory? Yeah, so the research that I'm gonna do now is gonna use grounded theory as a qualitative research method. Yes. So it'll be grounded theory using critical race theory as a lens, exactly.
Yeah, so yeah, I guess my question is similar to Rob's, and not necessarily like similarities, but do you see any conflicts across theoretical frameworks?
Well, I don't see conflicts. I don't see conflicts. I mean, I use physics identity and social interdependence in one of my studies, both of them. So I think they mix well. And maybe if I was studying, interactions of bigger groups where there's like a visible minority of students, I could kind of fit in the critical race theory with everything, right? Like if, like for example, this would be like, I don't know, if I had a group of students in a physics classroom, so I could study physics identity, that maybe there's 10 students and 2 of them are minorities and the other ones are white students or something. Maybe I could like use all 3 frameworks to maybe.
Yeah. So what I'm thinking, a little bit more specifically, you mentioned anti-Black technology and how it may be complicit in propagating these systems of oppression because of the lack of representation in the way that it concludes based off of those models. And in the multiple imputation, I believe that the data is filled in based off of the data set that was already present, right? And if I recall, Steve Cunham and Ximena Sid recently published a paper regarding the demographics of PER and how the demographics of the students that we study are not representative of the students that take physics classes and are not representative of the population of the United States. So in doing multiple imputation, it seems that we are susceptible and at risk of propagating this anti-Black technology, right? Because of the way that the data sets are not representative. So is there a way that multiple imputation considers these biases that are outlined in critical race theory as anti-Black technology?
Yeah, so multiple imputation cannot fix representation, right? Because multiple imputation what fixes representation is how you collect your data, right? In the beginning, like that is the only way. Yeah, I mean, multiple imputation is I would consider it as like a pure kind of technique, in the sense that it doesn't propagate anything or take away from anything. Like it doesn't Like it's just a way of filling in data.
Right. Based off of the sample, right?
Based off of your observation,
And so
yeah.
isn't that the case for this anti-black technology that we were discussing?
Well, yes, but as far as physics education research, your sample size, your sample is dependent on what you collect, like where you collect, and so I think the solution to that problem lies more in the hands of where we collect our data, because I think with that, because I read that paper, and she mentions how part of the reasons why that is the case, that misrepresentation of the reality, is because a lot of research, physics education research, is at R1 schools,
Right.
where there's a lot of like calculus based classes, and there's a lot of like, they're richer schools, right? They're schools that richer students, students that are more affluent go to.
Mm-hmm.
So there is this overrepresentation of white people. There's underrepresentation of algebra based college students because it's R1 schools. So I think to really tackle that issue, which is a very important issue you brought up, we have to just think about how we can recruit from other places.
And if I heard correctly, critical race theory highlights the need to begin research from the voice of the marginalized, correct?
Yeah.
So then it seems that multiple imputation on its own is not going to stop these systems from propagating, and which is why we need these multiple frameworks to build on each other to cover these things. So like critical race theory would help us cover the representation of our sample that is being multiply imputed. Makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few problems, right, that contribute to the misrepresentation of our data in PER. One of them is that like the distribution of students is just not the same across different schools, right? Like we already mentioned, R1 schools, right, have probably tend to have a lot more white kids, right? But then you have two-year colleges, which are on the opposite scale, right? Like a lot of people of color and people that have less money, right? They're gonna pick going to these cheaper education. I mean, I went to a community college, right? Because of that very reason, right? Because it's just cheaper. So that I think that's part of the problem. And obviously, and what sucks about PR, right, is that it's always easier to collect data from your own institution, right? So it's harder to collect data from, and it's easier to collect data from other R1 institutions than it is like other institutions where research isn't really conducted because the professors aren't as like, they're not as aware, they don't value it as much, right? Like for example, I'm recruiting people from I guess I shouldn't say the university, but I'm recruiting people from another university that's not University of Utah. And it was so easy for them to just share everything, you know, because they understand like the point of my project, they understand the importance of it. So they want to help the project, but sending, you know, I don't know if recruitment will be that effective when people aren't as like research oriented, you know, but maybe that's where government could step in. Maybe that's where, I don't know, government could step in and try to make some of these universities like collaborate more with R1 schools. I don't know. But definitely policy. I mean, I think that's like an important thing. It's maybe some types of policies have to be changed and how we can collect data.
I was going to ask a follow-up to what you were just talking about, and if one of the big issues is collecting data at R1 institutions, how might researchers who are at these large institutions approach people at smaller schools, maybe at community colleges, in a way that doesn't just take the data and then use that for their own research gains, but actually gives back to those schools and to the people that you're working with in the study?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really know, you know, because I'm not too like familiar with recruiting too much. Like, I mean, I just said a little bit. I would say, from my pure opinion, pure ignorant opinion, I would say that, well, maybe this advice doesn't really fit now because of the social distancing, but I would think that maybe the best way of making a good impression is, oh, you got it, Egla, sorry, um, um, is going in person and talking to the people and like, I don't know, because like I know FIU, for example, they do collaborate with like other smaller colleges, but the thing with FIU is that they are, well, it's a minority Hispanic, it's a minority serving institution. Well, it's not a problem, but it's like it doesn't fit the R1. Like, um, I know they send out people in person, I think, to talk to like deans and stuff like that. Um, and those connections already exist. So once you form those connections are there. I would just say like maybe the challenge is in forming those connections, and talking to the people that can actually make things happen, like the deans or the chairs of the departments. But yeah, I mean it's a problem, um, but I don't know how we can solve it.
Thanks for your answer, though. That was
But
helpful.
I'll say something. I think that the good thing is, right, and that's why we do research, and that's why like, um, that's why we do research, right? It's like we have to become aware of these things first before anything, right? And now that this paper has came out, I think it just came out this year, right? I think it was just this year or last year. It was a very recent paper. Now, as a community, we could really think about how can we deal with this problem, right? Because it is a problem that it has to be dealt with in the community level, right? Because even if individually people try to recruit in other universities that are more representative, right? Like it's not going to affect the wider problem, right? Like people have to like work together in some way, right? To make that happen. So yeah, the fact that we're talking about it is a good thing. And hopefully we continue talking about things and little by little with awareness, things will change, because that's little by little is the way things change, especially with big organizations like the physics education research community, right? Well, not well, community, I should say, not. I mean, it's not an organization, I guess, but it's a community. Um,
All right, well, we're coming up in the hour. Well, we already passed the hour. Thank you so much, Miguel. Is there any other questions that people have left before we head out?
well, thank you guys so much for having me. Thank y'all. It's been a pleasure talking to y'all.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you, Miguel, for being here. And again, we're going to have our next symposium next month with Dr. Lisa Goodahue. So keep an eye out for that. Again, Miguel, thank you so much for being here. And PERCoGS, thank you all so much for taking your time to organize this. Really appreciate y'all. All right, all our audience, thank you so much. Take care, everybody.